This is the Aware Families Podcast, the show that brings you a science-based, practical look at how to use the principles of functional medicine to keep your family healthy.
All right, welcome back to episode 2 of our Aware Families Podcast with Tom Flass and Brittany Coburn.
So this week we are going to talk about, we're going to start going through the pillars, and we're going to start with the first pillar, which is nutrition.
Yes. Now that is a loaded word.
Yes. So hot topic, controversial topic, so many opinions out there. It's always a buzzword, little media headlines. And so, again, how are we going to capture this unbelievably massive and controversial subject in the span of 30 to 40 minutes? We'll do our best. We're going to try to give a sort of a 10,000 foot overview of sort of what our take is and kind of the functional medicine approach to nutrition, and kind of talk about what we know, what we don't know, what's opinion, what's more science-based, and just kind of try to give some real basic guidelines.
Yeah, and some take-home things that people can start doing today. So to start to feel better.
And we kind of mentioned it, I think, in the first podcast, that separating out the science of nutrition and diet and sort of almost like the belief system. And there are certainly obviously religious beliefs that incorporate a lot of nutrition within that religious doctrine. But then there's also diets that almost have their own sort of quasi-religious beliefs around them, which make things a bit touchy, and people get really sensitive about it. So we're not here to offend anybody. We're not here to cast judgment on anybody. We're again trying to hold to what we think is like reasonable scientific evidence, and also with respect to individuality and the N of 1 approach, the personalized nutrition approach, and how do we apply these principles so that it really can incorporate many different types of quote unquote diets. And one of the other things is like nutrition versus diet, because there's the nasty D word that we try to avoid a lot of the time.
Right. But then in the world of medicine, right, diet just means what are you eating? And so I think that is one of those terms that it's nice to break down for just everybody to understand that the word diet doesn't mean you have to be on a diet.
Exactly.
Or a calorie restriction of some sort. It could just be, this is the typical food that we eat.
Your food intake pattern,
Yes.
perhaps, as another way
Correct.
of talking about it. And also separating out nutrition, which is more... what from the biochemical aspect a little bit, like the actual what we call macronutrients, the fats, carbohydrates, proteins, the micronutrients, which are your vitamins, your minerals,
Right.
some of your phytonutrients from plants and things like that, and how does that interact with the body? I think that's really more where nutrition is looking at, kind of more the sciencey, nuts and boltsy part of it.
Right, for sure. And you can be eating a very full diet and have minimal nutrition.
Oh,
right. And so that's another big
America.
piece. Yep. So standard American diet, right? SAD.
Yes.
That's what we talk about in functional medicine a lot. So Tom, describe in your words, what is the standard American diet?
Poor. So standard American diet, I think, is really, unfortunately right now, predominantly processed to highly processed foods. And that, I think, really underlies a lot of the current health issues we're facing as a nation, both pediatric and adult world. So we've kind of gotten to this state right now where convenience is king, and really like the faster you can get that food in you, is because we're all busy,
Right.
and so this is a real factor, and I'm not trying to discount
judgment.
that. Yeah, as busy parents, we kind of, and we're going to talk about this more as we go on. But the fact that our food system has somewhat been co-opted as well. And I think we probably mentioned this a little bit in the first episode, but there are hundreds, maybe more than hundreds of food additives in the U.S. food system that are not legal in most other countries.
Or they have a warning label if they're used.
Yes, or they have a warning label if they're used. And also again, the processing of it, we've become so removed from what real food actually is in some cases,
right?
And where this thing that you're eating is levels removed from what it actually grew out of the ground or from the animal that it came from, and not that that's necessarily always bad, but it really for a lot of those cases, that the good stuff is getting taken out and not so great stuff is getting put back in.
Right.
So that to me is like the standard American diet. It's like a lot of fast food, a lot of processed food. Unfortunately, sweetened beverages are a big part of that, and it's killing us.
Right. Yeah. So in addition to high fat, high sugar that you're talking about, also how far food has to travel, right, to get to our plate, and then the nutrient deficiencies just because of that alone, right? So if you're eating something local, the vitamin content in that fresh fruit or vegetable is so much higher than something that's traveled 2 weeks to get to you.
Yeah, and supporting local, I think, just from a
Huge.
economic business standpoint,
Yep.
but also from a health standpoint, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. You mentioned something else when we were just talking about highly processed versus minimally processed versus not processed. Do you want to explain a little bit more about what the difference between highly processed and minimally processed is?
So there's something that came, I don't know how many years ago that they came out. This is called it's an international classification called the NOVA classification, and it really stratifies the food as to how processed it is. And I think the most sort of dangerous aspect of those is what are called ultra processed foods, where if you look at the definition of that, there's little to no of the actual original ingredient of the food. So say if it was wheat that came out of the ground, and then all of a sudden you're extracting the wheat starch through multiple processes. And then so it's these foods that are made up of like an extracted wheat starch and a high fructose corn syrup and all these other chemical thickeners and additives. And you're looking through the ingredient list and you're like, where's the actual food in this? And that's what is really classified as these ultra processed food, which are a huge chunk of the American diet.
Right. Aren't they saying it's 70% of what kids are eating right now are ultra-processed foods?
Yeah.
They're higher than adults, actually.
And so when I wrote my book, I researched and they published the top 20 sources of calories for kids, and it is a horrifying list.
Yeah.
I think that there's only 4 or 5 real foods that were actually part of that list of the top 20 sources of calories.
Oh, gosh.
But the rest of it was like sweetened snack cakes and sweetened beverages and these like highly processed crackers and things like that. And so those are really the ultra processed foods, and I think that's where we and we'll talk about this in a little bit, like what are the problem with the highly processed foods and the ultra processed foods. But minimally processed are usually like if you're just getting something and you're harvesting the vegetables and then you process them by like cutting them up and freezing them. That's minimally processed. That is, yes, quote unquote processing, but that's very different than all these chemical extractions and manipulating these foods so that there's really little to none of the original food intact in the final product.
Right. And then a non-processed food would be something you pull straight off a tree or out of the garden, or so an apple, or eating bananas, something like that.
Or meat, something that hasn't been processed.
But I think
like
it's
that.
interesting to know and to just understand what the difference is between those terms, because we hear ultra processed thrown around constantly, right? But I think it's hard to recognize sometimes that, hey, that mac and cheese probably is ultra processed, right? Or whatever we're eating for dinner. Yeah.
And I always encourage like my patients, and when I do talks, like just become a label reader.
Yep.
Even though sometimes like, but really it pays to look and see what's actually in here.
Yeah.
And if you look on there and it's like a foreign language, then maybe you should be a little suspect.
Right. And how many ingredients are included, right? If you have 5 to 7 ingredients versus 35 ingredients. Yeah.
When there's something, it's like, why does this have 35 ingredients when it should just be like potato, salt, and oil or something like that?
Right. Totally. Yep.
And so the other thing I wanted, before we kind of get into breaking things down a little bit more, and I think part of the reason for the controversy is that nutrition science in general has been under scrutiny and for some good reason as well. The science of nutrition, I think in a lot of cases has kind of gotten co-opted. There's a lot of conflict of interest, and I forget, but Mark Hyman talks about this, and this has been, and I think Casey Means as well, like 90% of the research out there, the quote unquote scientific research that's been funded by the food industry is publishing results that are favorable for the food industry.
Right.
So it's like, not a shocker there,
Right. And they sit on the board.
Yeah. And the rest of it kind of gets swept over to the side or whatever. And so you have a lot of that to kind of contend with. I always encourage people, like, if you see this headline or there's a big study or whatever, always ask who funded that study.
Yep.
Follow the money a little
Follow the
bit
money
and
trail.
see if there are conflicts of interest, and is that possibly going to make that study a little less,
Right.
a little less valid. And one of the more extreme examples of this was something that I learned about actually from Robert Lustig, he's like the big anti-sugar guy from UCSF, and he's got a bunch of books and videos, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, some people from University of California, San Francisco unearthed these documents that were buried somewhere and found this paper trail essentially where the sugar industry paid off a bunch of these Harvard scientists to say that fat was bad and fat was causing heart disease and all these other things, but sugar was super healthy and that our cells needed the sugar to live, and so it basically demonized fat and made sugar seem like this great thing. And 50 years of healthcare policy from the government level were based on this research that came out that was funded by the sugar industry.
Right. The food guide pyramid, right, where the base was grains and
fats were way up there.
Were
and
way at the top.
I have a little bit. And that led to the whole
cereal, Pop-Tarts.
The Snackwell's generation, right? The super low fat foods that increased the amount of sugar in the foods to make up for the lack of flavor because they took the fat out.
The healthy fats in it.
And if you look at what happened with type 2 diabetes, obesity, all these other issues skyrocketed during this time. And so you can see what a disaster that was. And so some of these things that you could at one hand blow off, be like, whatever, but like with healthcare policy and the effect that had on the food industry and the effect that had on the health of Americans.
Right.
And we were still trying to dig out of that hole.
Oh, it'll be a while.
Yeah. And that was published in New York Times. That was published in JAMA. So, very reputable sources and they didn't get sued. So, it was actually true.
Right. Yeah.
So it's things like that kind of make people bristle sometimes with nutritional science.
Right. Yeah. And people don't understand. It seems like things flip-flop, right? Eat eggs, don't eat eggs. Eat oil, don't eat oil.
I know.
Eat sugar, don't eat sugar. Yeah. So I get why it's confusing.
Trust me, I'm a doctor.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly. So it's understandable to both of us why food is confusing. So our intent is just to help clarify some things and try to get some of the back to basics, maybe.
Yeah.
Back to understanding.
And
what
also
is
using
healthy.
that personalized approach. Is it right for you?
Exactly.
Right? Because that's, with these big sweeping things like these epidemiologic studies, which basically means studying a population, like what does this population eat?
Right.
And then trying to infer how does the food affect that? These are really difficult studies to get, I think, accurate assessment from. Right. And, they can maybe give you like an idea of what we should be studying maybe a little bit more, but that's really not telling you how the example I always give is like, as a population, eating peanuts is fine.
Right.
If you got a peanut allergy, it might land you in the ER,
Yep.
And so you can't, there's the N of 1 or there's the population study. So,
exactly.
And I think that it could be affecting a whole bunch of other things that we eat and put in our bodies, so.
For sure.
Functional medicine, obviously that N of 1, that personalized nutrition, personalized medicine approach really tries to embrace that.
Right. Yeah. And just flat out understanding that one guideline does not serve everyone.
Yes.
We definitely have to personalize it. But if we kind of look back then at some of the, more typical goals that we would be looking at in regards to protein, protein, fiber, what are your thoughts on protein intake for folks?
Yeah. So, I think that's sort of one of the big things if we break down sort of general principles that would help a lot of people is that I'd say most, I don't know about most, but a lot of people are not actually getting enough protein.
I would agree.
So they've revised the protein requirements. So they used to be done on what's called nitrogen balance, where they kind of measured your pee and how much nitrogen you were peeing out. And did that look like you were getting enough? And protein has a lot of nitrogen in there. So that would be their indirect way of trying to measure if there was enough protein going in. But new science has shown that those measurements are very, very inaccurate. And there's some other newer scores. There's something called the DIAS score, which is the digestible, indispensable amino acid score, which basically means like how digestible is that protein? How much of these really important amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, do those proteins have in there? And not all protein is considered equal.
Right.
And so now that we're looking at that, and actually Peter Attia, who we both listened to, he had a guy, Don Layman on, who's a PhD researcher. His entire career has been looking at protein and amino acids and looking at new ways of measuring this. And again, looking at the old research and finding out, for their opinion, that the protein intake and protein requirements were likely very underestimated, especially with certain subpopulations. So these three main amino acids, leucine, lysine, and methionine, or cysteine, which are closely related. I mean, these are like the building blocks of proteins. Those amount of those building blocks are not the same in all proteins.
Right.
And if you're getting like seemingly an adequate amount of protein, but not getting enough of these specific rate limiting important amino acids, then you could still be in some way, shape, or form almost like protein deficient. Like your body's not going to be able to do the things it needs to do. So, and previously we hadn't been taking this stuff into account.
Right. And I think one of the things you're alluding to a little bit here is maybe animal protein versus plant protein, and some of the differences that we're seeing in how your body is absorbing those types of proteins. And again, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and this gets to be a hot, very
deep.
controversial topic.
I was going to say, yeah, from somebody who's done I've done a lot of plant proteins, and I have to be very careful to make sure I get enough animal protein to balance, or enough variety of plant proteins to really get what I need.
And so I think this really speaks to, if you are somebody who is on a plant-based diet, if you're vegan, if you're vegetarian, both looking at the quantity of protein that you're getting, but also there's probably a few extra steps you're going to need to do to make sure that the quality is good. And I think a lot of these people probably need a protein supplement that's going to sort of make sure that you're getting these rate limiting amino acids in there. And there are some plant-based protein powders that are starting to beef up, no pun intended, I guess maybe pun intended, the amount of like the lysine and the leucine and things like that in there, because they're starting to look at this new science and realize these could be kind of rate limiting things. And don't get me wrong, I mean, there's people that do fantastic on a plant-based diet. And, I think it's probably a combination of their doing a really good job of the food combining to try to fill in these gaps. They're making an effort to get the right quantities. And I think they're probably just better, like their bodies are more efficient at extracting the amino acids out of the proteins and digesting. And maybe their gut microbiome is really attuned to that. And they seem to do well on that. But there's definitely plenty of people who don't. And I think they, for moral reasons, other reasons, are trying to adhere to this diet, but they're not really paying attention to this. But like, sooner or later, it can have biologic effects if you are not getting enough protein. You're in, whether that's muscle weakness and lack of muscle growth, which affects metabolism, whether it's your immune system's kind of crashing out and you're not able to make enough immune proteins, you're getting sick all the time,
fatigue,
other things like that. And so I think these are things to be considered, and it is a fact that these animal-based proteins are higher quality. And again, it's not a judgment for anybody that's following any particular diet, but I think that needs to be taken into account.
Right. And we're not out trying to give anybody medical advice. We are hoping anybody who's listening to this is also seeing their provider and making sure they're doing what's right for them. These are just kind of overarching things that we talk about in our practice.
Yeah. And I will say the other thing is, like, there's to some degree a little bit of like meat shaming going on in the kind of the public eye right now. But it is, especially for kids, I think. I mean, it's such a nutrient dense source of not only protein, but other bioavailable B vitamins, iron and zinc, which can be really rate limiting and deficient in a lot of kids and adults as well. So that there are real health benefits, and they've not been able to make it stick that meat intake is related to increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of cancer.
Right.
That's been controversial and fought vehemently back and forth, but I have not seen good, consistent research that shows me that it increases the risk. If you're eating super highly processed diet that contains super highly processed meat, that's
a different story.
That's a different story.
Because we're not looking at anything that's more natural. It's all highly processed.
But if you're eating unprocessed meat in your diet, or eggs, the same thing with that. Like eggs got demonized for years, and then it turns out dietary cholesterol has no adverse effects on health. Eggs are a nutrient powerhouse, especially if you're pregnant or whatever. Unless you have a sensitivity, eggs are great and a really high quality source of protein. So again, these things, somebody shouldn't feel bad if they are eating these things thinking that they're somehow doing themselves a disservice if it's in the context of an otherwise not highly processed food diet.
Right. Yeah. You know, and just like you mentioned, kids. So women, right? Women in perimenopause, menopause, I think historically have not focused on proteins. And so getting enough protein while you're going through that period of your life is really key. We need to be doing a lot of different things with exercise as well, but you got to have that protein as a baseline or you're not going to be able to do the different weight bearing exercises you need.
Yeah.
So having 20 to 30 grams per meal is the recommendation now, which was not the case 10 years ago.
No.
So it has shifted dramatically.
Yeah, so that means breakfast should be protein-based.
Yes.
Lunch should be protein-based. Dinner should be protein-based. And
Right.
then you build around that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, Gabrielle Lyon's whole point.
Yes.
You know, she's got that protein-centric
Yep.
eating, which I think there's some validity to
Right.
that. And
Yeah.
again, the new recommendation, just to get a rough sort of benchmark, it used to be that the recommendations were like 0.7 to 0.9 grams of protein per day per kilogram of body weight. And then that's been upped to like 1.2 to 1.5, especially as we age, because there's
Yep.
something called sarcopenia that
But
happens.
it's ideal body weight, not necessarily your current body weight.
And
was
I
one
don't know
thing.
if we really looked at like what your body composition and things like that. You could kind of adjust that, but
Yeah.
roughly that would mean a 150-pound person would then need 80 to 100 grams
Yep.
of protein per day. Again, keeping in mind that quality does matter,
Yep.
and if you were plant-based, that probably goes up a little bit, and or you have to make some adjustments to try to get those indispensable, really important amino acids in there.
Right. Yeah. So, okay, we've kind of hit protein. Let's move on to one of the next big ticket items, which is fiber.
Yes.
Fiber is fun to talk about.
Yes, because if you look at what the recommendations are and what Americans are actually getting, there's a pretty big gap.
Dismal.
Yeah.
Yes. So current recommendations for women are at least 25 grams of fiber a day, at least. Men, 35 to 40, right? That's kind of hard to do sometimes if you're not paying attention to it.
Oh yeah, and
Right?
average intake is I think 15 grams per
Or
day.
less.
So it's a wonder
Yeah.
why people have pooping problems.
Right? Yep.
But it's way more than about that, even though that's
Yes.
obviously a part of the puzzle. But yeah, so
Right.
why is fiber so important?
Yeah, we need fiber for a lot of different reasons, don't we? Definitely is going to help your microbiome, that hot ticket that we like to talk about, keep those microbiome critters happy, help actually reduce bloating. Because I know I talk about fiber with patients a lot, and they're very worried that the bloating is going to increase or that they're going to be constipated. And so we really have a lot of discussion on why fiber helps movement. Yeah.
Although if you go if you
you
increase
gotta,
too quickly,
you gotta go slow.
Yeah, increase slowly if you're increasing
Yes.
your fiber intake.
So if you are fairly fiber naive, we recommend slowly increasing to the goal, not just jumping straight
adding a
to
few
the goal.
grams a day.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So, one thing we do in our practice, I know, is we hand out a lot of information on where to find fiber. Right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
where easy sources of fiber. So I know I talk a lot about like fruits and veggies and eating the peel. When you're eating certain fruits, making sure you're eating the entire fruit, not just peeling an apple.
Well, and certainly
Right?
not the juice.
Right, yes.
has no
and
fiber.
when you're juicing can be great, but you're taking out all of the fiber
Yeah.
when you're doing that. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, other than beans and legumes and seeds, what are places you're telling people to get fiber?
Well, I tell people that I call it the whole grain ruse, right? So if you're looking at the label and they're like, oh, this is whole grain, and then you actually look at the label and read the grams of fiber, and you're
Yeah.
like, less than 1 gram of fiber. Like, how is that possible? So,
Yep.
so really, it has to say 100% whole grain if
Yep.
it actually contains some real whole grains in there. Otherwise, it's like anything that's made from a grain could be legally labeled in this country as whole grain, and it does not have to be whole grain.
Right.
So, but if it says 100% whole grain, then it does have to contain some of the fiber containing parts of whatever the original source was. And so I think looking for the 100% whole grain label is important, but also looking for the grams of fiber per serving. And whatever you're eating, I think it just ends up being sort of a comparison game. Like if you can
Yep.
find the higher fiber version of whatever you're eating, I think that it adds up over the course of the day.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I know I also will have people look at like the total carbohydrate intake divided by the fiber, right? And just see what that value can be sometimes when they're doing like choosing breads and whatever. If it has nuts and seeds, it can be a lot more helpful. But if you can get that carbohydrate divided by fiber to be 10 or less, it can be real helpful.
Okay.
Okay, so fiber.
But then adding fiber can be very useful.
Yes.
And helpful, especially when you're on the go and things like that. So, I use a lot of psyllium and recommend a lot of psyllium, which is spelled Psyllium.
Good. There you go.
Which is the active ingredient in Metamucil, but you can find it in a capsule form. You can find it in just a plain Jane powder form that you can mix with a smoothie or well, for kids I mix it, I call it magic applesauce. We mix it with applesauce and have them take some fiber in there. And I think a tablespoon is about 4 to 5 grams of fiber.
Okay.
Which is
that's
decent.
a good for sure.
And it forms a gel, so if you let it sit, it gets kind of thick and nasty.
Right.
So you have to
Best
either drink
do it right away.
Eat it right away. But again, a lot of soluble fiber in there. Again, the difference between soluble and insoluble fiber. You want both, but the insoluble just sort of sweeps stuff through your intestines. The soluble is the kind that absorbs certain things and helps to kind of get rid of some toxic stuff in your body, but also the soluble is the stuff that really feeds that gut microbiome, those probiotic bacteria living in your gut. And so psyllium's got a lot of soluble fiber, and I know you use a couple other things.
Yeah, well, and then I really try to talk about flax and grinding flax seeds and adding that to different things. I add a lot to oatmeal.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of different, hemp seeds and flax to oatmeal because you can hide a lot in there and it still tastes really good.
And what happens if you put intact flax seeds in things?
They come out and
and you don't really get the fiber out of them.
You don't really get much out of it. No. So, but you can tell what you ate.
Yeah, you got to grind them.
Yep. And then chia seeds. So chia is another really good option there. Just to be using. So that, and then we talk a lot about fermented foods for your gut microbiome, right? So sauerkraut, which I'm still just not a huge fan myself, but I'm working on it. Kimchi, kombucha. What's the kicker with kombucha though that we want to be careful of?
Oh, some of it's got 20-30 grams of sugar in it. And it also doesn't have the same strains of probiotics in there that like a sauerkraut or a kimchi does. So my take on it is that I know it's really hot right now, but it does not take the place of other fermented foods. It could be used in conjunction. And I think some people who have like a yeast or mold sensitivity may be a little sensitive to some of those things.
Yeah,
so I think you might have to watch.
Especially if they're high sugar.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I know like pickles, there are some pickles that are fermented, not just vinegar, right? And so you can that can still be an option for some people because I get a lot of questions about.
And there's pickles. A pickle sauerkraut that my kids love that it tastes like it's got dill pickle seasoning in there and actual slices of dill pickles. Okay. And so you're getting all the benefits of those, the probiotic bacteria in that fermented food, but it tastes like pickle, so you can use it as a condiment, put it on your burgers, whatever you want to do.
Right, your highly processed hot dog.
Hopefully non-processed hot dog.
Okay, what about phytonutrients? This is another one that we spend a lot of time talking about, and I really focus on it with kids too, and just understanding that the rainbow of foods and then getting a color or a food from every color of the rainbow every single day.
So Skittles.
Right, exactly. Yes, I say except Skittles. Yes. That usually comes up.
Yes, because it's like a rainbow. But eating the rainbow, so colorful fruits and vegetables and these. So phytonutrients, which is a huge, very hot topic of research right now, are the things that sort of chemical compounds naturally occurring in foods that give them their bright colors and give them other health benefiting properties. They're antioxidants, right? They help to kind of protect your body against toxic stuff from the environment or toxic stuff that's made in your body. But one of the really interesting, I guess the two other really interesting things is some of them are also food for the microbiome and that your gut bacteria, the good gut bacteria.
Keep them happy.
Yes. Well, these colorful things will feed them and they actually kind of activate them in your body to make them more helpful to you. The good
ones.
Yeah.
So they're actually helping the good ones and they don't feed the bad ones as much. So, super beneficial.
And there's a process called epigenetics that is a really big area of research right now. And a lot of what we talk about with the pillars are how these things, and what that means is like your DNA is not your destiny. It's like what turns on or turns off these certain genes. And over the course of your life, if you make a lot of good, healthy choices, good sleep, good exercise, good food, these are actually turning off genes for cancer, turning off genes for diabetes, and
Yes.
turning on the genes that protect your body against toxic stuff and things like that. And so these phytonutrients are huge for trying to turn on those genes for the protective mechanisms and turn off the genes for like cancer and diabetes.
Yeah, and autoimmune disease.
Yeah,
So
yep.
those are big ones. So phytonutrients, fiber, fermented foods. Even though phytonutrients is with a PH, it still sounds like an F. So I always talk about the 3 Fs for the microbiome. Okay, well, we would be, remiss if we didn't talk about sugar.
Yes.
So sugar and the whole added sugar versus natural sugars, fructose versus the other types of sugar. Like, I don't know. What's your quick spiel on sugar?
Yeah. So again, through work of a couple docs who I've had the pleasure to discuss this with and work with a little bit, like Robert Lustig from University of California, San Francisco, and Rick Johnson from University of Colorado, and both of them have books and YouTube videos and stuff on this. Fructose, which is a naturally occurring sugar, it's like the kind of the fruit sugar, is at the amounts we're eating in the American diet, essentially a metabolic toxin. It's actually like poisonous to your body. What's interesting is like no cell in your body can actually use fructose for energy. It's like, oh, sugar is energy. Your body uses glucose, which is different than fructose. When it gets these huge loads of this fructose sugar in your body, it can't use it directly. So it either has to convert it over into fat, which are triglycerides, or try to convert some of it over into glucose so it can burn it. And with the amount, like if you drink a big soda, you've already blown through your body's ability to process that because of all that high fructose corn syrup.
In one sitting.
And we were meant to have maybe a few grams of fructose daily, which your body can totally metabolize, and that's fine. And then, for animals, we look at, the grizzly bears eating all the huckleberries and things like that. The fruit, which has a lot of fructose, actually allows them to fatten up for the winter. It's an energy storage molecule. It's not an energy burning molecule. So if you want to store a lot of energy as fat, then fructose is great.
Yeah.
But that's kind of that's not good for our bodies, and and we don't hibernate for the winter, and so we don't need that kind of thing. So the things that fructose does in the body, and they've actually done studies where they fed people the same amounts of fructose or glucose, straight fructose, or high fructose corn syrup, and I can't remember how many grams. It was probably like 40 plus 50 grams added to their regular diet, and then waited a couple weeks and measured their labs and saw, even within a couple weeks' time, their risk markers for cardiovascular disease and things like prediabetes started shooting way up there. So there's something about fructose that kind of gums up the cells. And so a calorie is not a calorie. That's a total myth, know. And they've done these side-by-side studies that these two different sugar molecules are metabolized very differently. They cause increased inflammation, which is can lead to any number of disorders. They feed the bad gut bacteria, which is not good.
Which then leads to bloating and irregular bowel habits, or
irritable
not normal pooping.
So there's the irritable bowel component. And just like everybody's heard of lactose intolerance, there's actually a fair number of people with fructose intolerance, and they just don't metabolize it or absorb it, and then it causes all the GI distress that lactose intolerance could. And then if you kind of cut back on that, all of a sudden, lo and behold, the GI symptoms get better.
Right.
Fructose has also been associated with increasing leaky gut. This has been a little bit controversial, but several studies showing that it increases that leakiness of the intestine, which can be related to other things like cognitive decline and behavioral things, mental health things, cardiovascular risk.
Hyperactivity, anxiety.
So all in all, I think the biggest take home of that is like trying to cut down the amount of added sugar, because most of the added sugar that's in our diet is fructose, or somehow fructose related, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or some other extract. And added sugar in this country goes by, a couple hundred different names that they have for it.
Yep.
It's,
there are multiple books that talk about, I know Dr. Elisa Song's book, Happy, I can't remember the name of it now.
Yeah.
It's amazing, but she actually gives a list of all the names that sugar goes by when you're looking
Robert
at kids'
Lustig's
stuff.
book as well, and it's on his website, and so it kind of pays to read labels again with that. And so the guidelines are for women 25 grams of added sugar or less per day. So that's for women and children. And for men, it's like 36 grams. And just for sort of frame of reference, one soda has got 36 to 40 grams and that's a 12-ounce soda.
Right.
And you can't get a 12-ounce soda anymore if you've noticed that.
There's 16 or 20.
Yes.
Yeah.
So bonus for the U.S.
Oh my gosh, I know. Yet again, right?
Yep.
The U.S. standard American diet strikes again.
So I think that and really if you make no other change with your diet when you're starting to try to improve your diet is cutting back on the added sugar, start reading labels, try to get to that 36 grams or 30 grams a day of added sugar or below. That alone can cause this positive cascade of events in your
you don't
body.
even have to avoid certain foods if you're just what you said. You're striving for your protein intake, you're striving for your fiber intake, and we reduce sugar. You will hit your goals.
Yeah.
You don't have to be on a specific diet avoiding things.
But, sugar addiction is a very real thing.
Right? The study with sugar and cocaine where the rats went to sugar every time.
Yeah, and they did those brain scans and showed that the same areas that light up in the brain when somebody does cocaine light up when they eat sugar as well.
Yep.
And it really does. It meets all the definitions of a substance of abuse.
Yeah.
Kind of that dopamine hit.
Yep.
It's got sort of that reward pathway. It's got unfavorable health benefits. People have a hard time quitting.
Yeah, I know when I do it, I have to just go cold turkey on added sugar. And I do it for 2 weeks, and then I don't crave it anymore.
But it can be
works.
Tough.
Oh, it for sure.
People
You
go
can
through
get
some
very
withdrawals.
cranky.
Yeah.
We won't ask my husband what he thinks about.
It's like a different type of hangry.
It's a different hangry. Yeah. So, again, no judgment on it. And we understand that it's everywhere. And so it's really hard to avoid. You have to, be a detective in the grocery store, which then when you're already on a time restraint and now you're reading every single label, it can be tough. So.
But just like choosing the highest fiber one, choose the lowest sugar variety.
Sugar. Yep. And make 1 to 2 changes a week. You don't have to go and revamp your entire diet in a day.
But, and I guess one last word on that is there are a lot of these other, sugar substitutes for these things that are labeled as keto, and they're using what's called these alcohol sugars.
Yep.
So erythritol, maltitol, I'm trying to think of some of the other, sorbitol. And some people do not tolerate these from either a microbiome or a digestive standpoint.
They can have a lot of GI issues.
Yeah. So be cautious if it has some of those things in there and test drive it before you fully go down that path.
For sure. So the last little thing we have, and we only have about a minute, but food allergies.
Oh, we didn't talk about fat.
Oh, we didn't talk about fat.
No, we got to talk about fat real. So we can try to do that in just a few minutes.
Okay, fat.
So fat is not the enemy.
No.
We've been led to believe this for 50 years.
I can't believe we almost forgot fat.
I know.
Sorry.
How could you? That's like
I
nerd out about fat.
I'm really glad that you came back to fat.
Since I did my master's thesis in omega-3 fatty acid research.
How did I forget? Okay.
So, so there's kind of the big overarching things of the types of fat. There's saturated fat, there's unsaturated fat. The biggest, I'd say, bad fats out there are the trans fats, which were the chemically produced fats that were used for years in the food supply, and then lo and behold, that's actually causing heart disease, cancer, potentially Alzheimer's, all these things. So it's been being removed. It's mostly removed, but not entirely removed from the U.S. food supply. But some of these other, we talked about the processed seed oils, and that they're starting to look at some of these things as being not necessary. And this is controversial and a hot topic right now, there's some research to suggest that the highly processed vegetable and seed oils may also have some unfavorable effects.
Right. So we're kind of, when people ask me what to choose, I'm kind of pushing towards, olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil to some extent, but mainly butter. Real butter.
Go back to real butter.
It's, again, another one. Butter has been on the chopping block just like eggs.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. And cold pressed, right? So different ways to work with it. What are some seed oils that you specify if you're telling people, hey, you might want to just be cautious of these seed oils?
Well, I mean, I'd say just be careful, the sunflower, safflower,
Grapeseed,
and cottonseed for sure.
Cottonseed, yeah.
But even canola, I know that's a controversial one. I don't use canola oil.
I don't use it.
There's the whole GMO thing, which we're not going to go down that rabbit hole now. But just again, the processing of it, I think, matters. And and if you got a high oleic, which means it's got some components in there that are more like olive oil, and the canola does have some of the precursor omega-3s, not the kind that's used by your body, but like the precursor for those. It does have some of that in there, but I would be cautious unless I knew it was from somewhere that really handled it well, cold pressed, not, super chemically processed, and
Right.
And even then, I just say I agree, olive oil,
Cautious,
avocado oil for most of your cooking type of stuff. And then most Americans are deficient in omega-3s.
Yep.
Because they don't eat fish, and people are scared to eat fish because of some of the contamination factor, which is a legitimate concern.
For sure.
Although they call them the smash fishes, right? Like so sardines, not contaminated really much and have wicked high omega-3. Herring, same thing, not really contaminated because they're smaller fish.
Yep.
Salmon, by and large, especially if you can get wild caught, although I know it's getting spendier and spendier, but that salmon is not as contaminated as some of the other fish, and I think is still a fairly safe bet.
Versus like tuna and the concerns with some of that.
Yeah. The bigger the fish, the more potential for mercury contamination, which is really unfortunate, especially when you're
and the
pregnant.
whitefish,
You don't want to kind of mess around with that. Actually, trout is pretty decent too.
Nice.
And here, we have the kokanee, which are these little landlocked salmon, and they're all over Montana, and you can catch those, and they're delicious. Or the lake trout, which is actually technically in the salmon family, and they will have a pretty good amount of omega-3 as well. So, and they're pretty clean fish. So I think those are all good things to be eating as well for the omega-3s. And so the big difference there is like there's two main families of these, what they call polyunsaturated fatty acids. And so there's a family of them called omega-6s, and there's a family of them called the omega-3s. And they're the yin and yang of fats. And so you need a balance like everything. But we evolved on like maybe a 1-to-1, 2-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So pretty good, equal amounts of both. And now we're on like a 20-to-31 omega-6 because of the highly processed food diet, which really pushes us down this inflammation pathway and really imbalances so many things in our body. So trying to up those omega-3s to try to, and come down on some of the omega-6s has a lot of potential health benefits. So if people don't eat fish, I always recommend a high quality cod liver oil or omega-3 supplement, something that has the two main fats that your body does use called EPA and DHA, which are the main fats in something like a cod liver oil.
Right. Yeah. And we'd be happy if anyone called our office or wanted to come in, we'd be happy to share specific recommendations of
and you can test
oils.
these in your blood too. You can actually check to see what your ratios are. There's something called an omega index that's testable and shows you how, if you're in that balance or how far off balance you are.
Right.
So I think that's really interesting. But just also keep a note that omega-3 supplements, quality matters.
It does.
If it smells like something that washed up on the shore, don't take it because it's probably rancid. And they found that like up to 50% of supplements at one point, there's a study done probably like 8 or 10 years ago, up to 50% of them were partially rancid, which is frightening.
So that's where you do want to be specific on who you're purchasing from, what brand. So they're quality controlled.
And flax oil, whereas I think especially if it's cold pressed and kept in the fridge, can be good, but that's again one of those precursor omega-3s.
Right.
It's not the same thing as taking EPA and DHA, those kind of fish oil type of fish.
Right. Gotcha. All right. Well, we are going to need to just add on to our next episode 3. We'll do a brief once over of food sensitivities, food allergies that time. But for today, I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah. We don't want to drone on for too long.
No, for sure.
So thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thank you for spending time with us today.
And join us for the next episode, which is going to be pillar number 2, sleep. But we can, maybe just briefly talk about the food sensitivity things because that's kind of involved in almost every aspect of what we do and a huge topic in functional medicine.
Yep.
Awesome. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. See you next time.